What if I told you that a single child, sold for just $3 in 1849, would one day change the destiny of the United States? That a boy, no older than 7, mute and terrified, holding a strange journal no one could read, would shake the foundations of power and expose secrets buried for generations. This is not a myth, not a legend, it's a story America tried to forget. But history has a way of whispering the truth back into the light. Story Part 1, The Auction of Shadows. On the morning of August 12, 1849, Charleston, South Carolina, woke under a thick, suffocating heat. The streets near Chalmers Street smelled of salt, tar, and sweat. Merchants shouted prices, horses kicked up dust, and in the middle of that bustling noise, a small brick building stood quietly, a place where human lives were measured, priced, and sold. Inside, the air was heavy with despair. Men, women, and children stood in rows, their faces blank, waiting for the next shout that would decide their fate. This was not unusual in Charleston. It was routine, a business like any other. But that morning, something different was about to happen, something that would ripple through history. A child, no more than 7, stood in a corner clutching a small leather journal against his chest. His clothes were ragged, hanging loosely on his thin frame. His eyes, deep and unblinking, carried a strange awareness, as if he could see more than anyone else in the room. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't move unless pushed. It was as though silence itself had chosen him as its vessel. Samuel Rutledge, the auctioneer, had seen thousands of souls pass through his hands. But this boy unsettled him. There was something off, not just the silence, but the way the child looked at him. Almost like he was being studied. Observed. Rutledge flipped open his ledger. Male child. About 7 years old. Origin unknown. Mute. Carries personal effects. 1 journal. He didn't even bother writing the child's name, because no one knew it. The man who had brought the boy in, a trader named Harrison Vance, leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his face. Found him in Savannah, he said. Came off a Portuguese ship. Captain said the mother died of fever 3 days from shore. Some sailor paid him to bring the boy to land instead of throwing him overboard. I don't ask questions, I just move cargo. Rutledge raised an eyebrow. And the journal? Wouldn't let go of it, Vance shrugged. Some say the writing's Arabic, others say it's older than that. No one can read it. But the boy guards it like it's his soul. Rutledge examined the leather-bound book. The cover was worn, soft from years of touch. Strange symbols covered the first few pages, beautiful, looping shapes that seemed almost alive. He felt a small chill crawl down his spine and quickly shut it. How much do you want for him? Vance sighed. Just get rid of him. $5 and he's yours. Rutledge knew that was cheap, even for a child. But something about the situation made him want it over with quickly. He paid the money and scheduled the boy for the last slot of the day's auction. By noon, 11 people had been sold. Sweat glistened on Rutledge's face as he prepared the final lot. The crowd had thinned, leaving only a handful of buyers. The boy stood in the harsh sunlight, small and motionless, still holding the journal. The murmurs began. Too young, can't work, not worth it. Rutledge was ready to end the sale when a voice from the back interrupted. $3, the man said. Everyone turned. A tall stranger stepped forward, dressed entirely in black despite the blazing heat. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes sharp as a blade. His northern accent cut through the southern air like a foreign wind. $3 for the boy, he repeated. And the journal comes with him. Rutledge frowned. $3? That's an insult. The journal's worthless to you, the stranger said calmly. You can't read it. But I can. A ripple of whispers passed through the few who remained. No one had claimed to understand the book before. Rutledge studied the man's face. There was something wrong about him, his stillness, his cold confidence. It wasn't just his northern accent. It was the feeling that he knew far more than he should. $3, the stranger said again, his voice low but commanding. And I'll take him now. Rutledge hesitated. He had invested $12 total, including food and lodging. Selling for $3 meant losing money. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted this man gone. His presence was like the air before a thunderstorm, charged, dangerous, and heavy. "Deal," Rutledge said finally. $3. The stranger stepped forward, took the boy's hand gently, and placed 3 silver coins on the table. His hand was cold. The child didn't resist. "What's your name, sir?" Rutledge asked. The man looked up, eyes glinting. "It doesn't matter." Then he turned and led the child away through the courtyard gate, disappearing into the narrow streets of Charleston. Rutledge stood frozen for a moment. When he finally looked down, he noticed that the stranger had left behind one of the coins. It wasn't American. It was older, darker, etched with the same strange symbols as the boy's journal. That night, as Rutledge closed his ledger, he realized something deeply unsettling. He hadn't written down the man's name, and the child's entry had somehow vanished from his records. The ink was still wet from earlier sales, but where the boy's name had been, there was only a faint, empty line, as if it had never been written at all. Rutledge stared at the blank space until the candle flickered out. Somewhere in the dark, far from Charleston, a new chapter of American history had just begun, one no one would dare record. End of Part 1. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, The Stranger's Secret, keeping the same eerie historic tone and YouTube storytelling style, 1000 words? Part 2. The Book of Shadows. Imagine this. A mute child sold for $3 in a slave auction suddenly vanishes with a mysterious stranger, and years later, he reappears hundreds of miles away, holding the same strange journal no one can read. But what's inside that book terrifies even scholars. It holds secrets so dangerous that men are willing to kill for them. What if this child carried the truth powerful enough to rewrite America's history itself? Stay with me, because what happens next will send chills down your spine. Story Part 2, The Book of Shadows. The day after the auction, Samuel Rutledge sat alone in his home on Trad Street, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. He'd conducted thousands of sales before, but this one refused to leave his mind. Every time he tried to picture the stranger's face, it slipped away like smoke. Even hours later, he could not recall his features, just the feeling of unease that hung in the air, heavy as the Charleston humidity. He wrote down every transaction in his ledger that night, except one. For reasons he couldn't explain, the entry for the child and the stranger remained blank. He told himself he would fill it in later, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't. Some things felt better left unwritten. The next morning, the steamer Magnolia left Charleston Harbor, bound for the northern coast. Among its passengers, according to what little remains of its logs, was an unnamed man traveling with a boy listed simply as servant. That record vanished within months, just like the names of others connected to this strange journey. No one knew where they went. But months later, whispers began spreading through the Underground Railroad network. A silent child had appeared at a Quaker school in rural Pennsylvania. He spoke little, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent. And he never let go of a small leather book, even while he slept. The woman who ran that school was named Patience Hadley, a former abolitionist who had turned her home into a refuge for free black children and escaped slaves. She recorded her thoughts each night in her diary, a diary that historians would one day call the most valuable piece of evidence in this mystery. Her entry from September 18, 1849, reads, "A child has come to us, brought by a man who would not give his name. He said only that the boy must be taught to read and write English and that no one must ever take his book from him. He left $50 in gold for the child's care. I fear we have become guardians of something far greater than a child." The boy's silence lasted for months. He watched everything, studied everyone. The other children began calling him Book, because wherever he went, the journal went with him. By winter, Book had begun to speak. Quietly, cautiously, as if testing each word. He learned English faster than any student Patience had ever taught. Within a year, he could read aloud with clarity, though he rarely spoke about himself. He absorbed everything, mathematics, scripture, history, and yet, every time someone asked about the journal, his eyes would darken. "It's my mother's," he would say. "It's not for reading." Patience Hadley admired the child's brilliance, but strange things began to happen. Travelers arrived at her school, polite at first, then persistent, always asking the same questions. Any new children? Any with unusual possessions? A foreign-looking boy, perhaps? Patience lied each time, saying no. But the fear grew. Someone was searching for the child. Not one person, but several groups, working separately, hunting the same thing. 4 years passed. By 1853, Book was 11 and already more educated than many grown men. He never caused trouble, but his presence seemed to attract it. That spring, a traveling scholar arrived at the school drive. Edwin Hartwell, an expert in ancient languages. Patience hoped he might help decode the boy's strange journal. She waited until the children were asleep before showing it to him. For hours, Hartwell studied the symbols by candlelight. Then, suddenly, he went pale. "Where did this come from?" he whispered. "It belongs to one of my students," Patience said. "He's had it since before I met him." Hartwell closed the book carefully, his fingers trembling. "It's Arabic, but not any form I've seen. It's ancient, mixed with symbols of only encountered in pre-Islamic texts from North Africa. Mrs. Hadley, do you understand what this is?" She shook her head. "No, but the boy guards it like his life depends on it." Hartwell nodded slowly. "He has reason to. This journal contains records, transactions, names, events, from centuries ago. Evidence of things powerful people in this country would kill to keep hidden. Some of the families mentioned here helped build the American slave trade itself. This isn't just history, it's a confession." Patience's blood ran cold. "What should I do?" Hartwell's eyes darted toward the door. "Teach him to hide. And whatever happens, never let anyone take this book." The next morning, Hartwell was gone. No one ever saw him again. 2 weeks later, just past midnight, the school was attacked. 3 men broke in, tearing through rooms, demanding to know where the boy with the foreign book was. The children screamed. Shots were fired. Patience and her oldest students fought back with hunting rifles, forcing the men to flee. But the message was clear: the child wasn't safe anymore. That night, as smoke from the gunfire lingered in the halls, Patience packed a small satchel. With help from her contacts in the Underground Railroad, she arranged for the boy to flee north, toward a settlement near Albany, New York, a place where he could disappear. Before dawn, she found him awake, sitting by candlelight, writing. "Child," she asked softly, "do you know what's written in that journal?" The boy looked up, his face illuminated by the flame. For the first time, his voice carried a quiet strength. "My mother told me." Patience's heart pounded. "Told you what?" She said, "The book is the truth. The real history of where we came from and where we were going." She said powerful men stole our story, erased it, and built their power on those lies. "This book proves it." "What kind of proof?" Patience whispered. "Names, places, deals. It shows how they took our people, our land, and turned it into their wealth. It tells how blood built their empires." He touched the worn cover of the journal gently. "They'll kill to keep it buried. But I promised her I'd keep it safe. It's all I have of her." Patience felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to tell him that no book could be worth a life. But deep down, she sensed it wasn't just a book. It was a weapon, and he was its last protector. By sunrise, the boy known as Book was gone, carried north under false names, leaving the school silent and watchful. The only thing Patience Hadley kept was his empty chair, and a fear that she had just sent something into the world that would change everything. End of Part 2. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, The Vanishing in Albany? Next, keeping the same eerie, historic, and YouTube narrative tone, around 1,000 words. Part 3. The Hidden Ledger. What if a book buried beneath a workshop floor held the power to destroy the richest families in America? What if a boy, once sold for $3, grew up to become the keeper of a secret that could shatter the foundation of the nation itself? Tonight, we continue the true and chilling journey of Thomas Freeman, the boy once called Book, as he hides his mother's journal and walks straight into the storm of the coming Civil War. Story Part 3, The Hidden Ledger. June 1853. The boy arrived in Albany, New York, tired, quiet, and carrying nothing but a small satchel and the memories of everything he'd lost. Marcus and Judith Thatcher, a kind couple who ran a cooperage, a workshop that made barrels for merchants, took him in. Marcus had once been enslaved but had bought his freedom 20 years earlier. Judith had been born free. They had no children of their own, and when the boy appeared at their door, they welcomed him without question. In their home, the boy finally chose a name for himself, Thomas Freeman. Freedom was both his new name and his silent promise. He would no longer be a shadow from someone else's story. He would write his own. Thomas was clever. Within months, he learned to shape wood into perfect barrels, his hands precise and quick. But what truly amazed Marcus was the boy's mind. He could calculate volumes and angles faster than any worker. Soon, the cooperage thrived as never before. Customers came from all over Albany to order from Marcus and his brilliant young apprentice. But even as life grew peaceful, Thomas never forgot the warning of Dr. Hartwell. The night men broke into the Quaker school. Beneath the workshop floor, hidden inside a small oilskin pouch, lay his mother's journal, the book written in strange symbols and Arabic script, the one that had cost her life. It remained buried, untouched, but never far from his thoughts. The 1850s were turbulent years. Albany, like the rest of America, was divided. The Underground Railroad ran through the city's heart, carrying fugitives toward freedom, while Southern sympathizers plotted to protect their profits. Thomas listened to fiery debates in taverns and read newspapers by lantern light. Every headline, every political speech reminded him that the system that had enslaved millions still ruled the country's soul. He was 14 when he heard about the Dred Scott decision in 1857, when the Supreme Court declared that Black Americans could never be citizens. That night, fury and sorrow burned inside him. He went to the cooperage after dark, lifted the floorboards, and retrieved his mother's journal. By candlelight, he opened its pages again. The handwriting was delicate, careful. Some passages were his mother's words. Others were copied from older documents, ledgers, letters, contracts. The earliest entries dated back to the 1700s and revealed truths that official history had buried. Thomas read about European traders who had twisted African conflicts into excuses for capture. He saw evidence that the Atlantic slave trade had been rewritten to look lawful, hiding the theft and deceit behind it. And then came the American names, families in Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, and New Orleans, families who had murdered, forged, and trafficked human lives, all while claiming respectability. His mother had worked close enough to these people to steal their secrets. Over the years, she had copied the evidence by hand, knowing that someday, someone, maybe her son, would need to expose it. Now Thomas understood why strangers had hunted him. The journal wasn't just history, it was a weapon. He swore that night to protect it until the world was ready. He would wait, he would watch, and when the time came, he would strike with truth, not vengeance. Years passed. By 1860, at just 17, Thomas Freeman was a respected craftsman and businessman. He co-owned the cooperage with Marcus, managed accounts, and had even purchased a small home of his own. To the outside world, he was an ambitious young man living the American dream. But beneath that calm surface, Thomas prepared for war. He corresponded secretly with former students from Patience Hadley's school. He made contacts with journalists and abolitionists. Quietly, he began researching the families named in his mother's journal, comparing their descendants, wealth and positions. The same bloodlines that had enslaved his ancestors were now funding the political fight to preserve slavery. Then came April 1861. Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter. The war began. Albany became a city of uniforms and drums. Young men marched off to battle while the cooperage shifted to producing barrels for the Union Army, powder kegs, food containers, water casks. Thomas's work was considered essential, keeping him from being drafted. But he could feel the nation tearing itself apart, and he knew the truth in his mother's journal could ignite a fire more powerful than any cannon. One evening in November 1862, as snow began to fall, a man knocked on his door. He was tall, sharp-eyed, and wore the insignia of a Union officer. "Mr. Freeman," he said. "Colonel Isaac Brennan, War Department, Washington." Brennan's tone was polite but cold. "We're gathering intelligence on Confederate families and their finances. I've been told you possess certain records, historical ledgers, that could help the Union cause. Thomas froze. His pulse quickened. I don't know what you're talking about. Brennan smiled thinly. I think you do. The journal your mother protected. The one she died for. Thomas's blood turned to ice. How did this man know? Brennan stepped closer. You could help end this war. That journal holds evidence linking wealthy families to Confederate supply chains. With it, we could cut off their funding. Save lives. Thomas hesitated. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Truth is a weapon, but weapons can wound the wielder. If I give it to you, Thomas said quietly, you could use it wrong. Brennan's eyes narrowed. We're at war. The president has suspended habeas corpus. I could search this house right now. But I'd rather not. You have 3 days, Mr. Freeman. Then I'll return, with or without your cooperation. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at his table, the journal open before him. His mother's words were still as sharp as the day she wrote them. Choose your moment carefully. At dawn, he made his decision. He would not hand over the original. Instead, he would create a copy, one that revealed the truth but kept the original safe. For 2 days straight, he worked without rest, transcribing every page, every date, every Arabic phrase. He translated what his mother had written, verified the American names through public records, and added annotations proving the accuracy of her claims. The result was no longer a mystery written in foreign letters, it was a history no one could deny. When Colonel Brennan returned, Thomas handed him the thick-bound transcript. Where's the original? Brennan demanded. Safe, Thomas said. What you hold is enough. The truth, documented and proven. Use it wisely. Brennan flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from suspicion to awe. If this is real, it could destroy powerful men, even some in Washington. Then maybe that's what needs to happen, Thomas replied. Brennan left with the document, promising that the information would serve the Union. For a while, peace returned. Thomas felt lighter, as if the ghosts of his past had finally released him. But by early 1863, strange things began to happen. A fire broke out next to the cooperage, small, but deliberate. A week later, Thomas realized he was being followed by unknown men. Letters he sent never arrived. Letters he received came already opened. His business began to falter as clients backed away without explanation. Marcus Thatcher noticed first. Son, he said, what have you done? Thomas told him everything, the journal, the copy, the colonel. Marcus sighed heavily. You poked a hornet's nest. These people you named, they have long arms and sharp teeth. War or no war, they'll come for you. Thomas stared into the fire. What do I do? Leave, Marcus said. Tonight, I have a cousin in Michigan. He runs a lumber mill near Saginaw. You'll be safe there. Lay low until this blows over. Thomas hesitated. Running felt like betrayal, to his mother, to the truth. But deep down, he knew Marcus was right. The men watching him were not soldiers. They were something worse. As the sun set over Albany, Thomas packed his few belongings, wrapped his mother's journal once more in oilskin, and prepared to vanish. He didn't yet know that the road ahead would lead him into the darkest chapter of his life, and into the very heart of the conspiracy his mother had died to expose. End of Part 3. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, The Disappearance in Saginaw? Next, in the same style, historical, suspenseful, and YouTube narrative tone around 1,000 words. The fire in Albany was just the beginning. Thomas thought he could outsmart the powerful men chasing him, but the shadows that followed him were not only human, they were ancient, patient, and bound to the secret written in his mother's journal. What started as a story of freedom was about to become a haunting journey through betrayal, blood, and revelation. Part 4. The Escape North. Thomas left Albany the same night Marcus begged him to go. The sky was bruised with smoke from the burned warehouse, and the streets shimmered with cold rain. He carried little, some clothes, a few tools, and the oilskin pouch that held his mother's journal. He didn't look back. Every sound behind him felt like a threat, every shadow a spy. Marcus's cousin in Michigan ran a lumber mill near Saginaw, deep in the woods. It was a place far from war, from politics, and from the watchful eyes that had followed Thomas for months. He traveled under a false name, using papers Marcus had arranged. On the train west, Thomas stared out the window at the endless forests, the rivers that glinted under the moon, and he thought of his mother's words, "Truth is a weapon, but weapons can wound the wielder." When he arrived in Saginaw, the air was heavy with the smell of pine and sap. The mill sat on the edge of a vast forest, the trees stretching into darkness like sentinels guarding secrets of their own. Marcus's cousin, Henry Thatcher, was a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and kind eyes. He welcomed Thomas without question. "Your family," Henry said simply. "And family looks after its own." For a while, Thomas felt safe. He worked hard at the mill, helping calculate loads, design storage crates, and improve efficiency. His skill with numbers and engineering soon made him valuable. But the nights were difficult. Every creak of the old cabin he slept in made him sit up straight, listening. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had followed him through the wilderness. One night, a strange thing happened. He woke suddenly around midnight to the sound of whispering outside his window. He looked out but saw no one. Only fog rolling off the river. He opened the door, and the whispering stopped. Yet faint footprints, bare and small, like those of a child, led from his porch to the edge of the forest. He followed them with a lantern, but they vanished among the roots of an ancient oak. That same week, Henry's foreman found strange symbols carved into the trunks of trees near the mill. Circles intersected by lines, written in an old style that no one recognized. The loggers laughed it off as the work of bored children, but Thomas felt a chill deep in his bones. He had seen similar symbols before, in the margins of his mother's journal, drawn beside passages copied from the oldest Arabic sections. He returned to the cabin that night and opened the journal. He turned to a section written in a trembling hand, one he had never read before. The passage described rituals performed by North African traders in the 1700s, ceremonies to bind truth into objects, to ensure it could never be erased or altered. The words suggested that knowledge itself could take form, could live, could hunger. He read until dawn, his hands shaking. If the journal truly carried such power, it explained why men had killed for it, why he could never seem to escape it. By autumn, rumors began spreading in Saginaw. Strange lights in the forest. Lumbermen vanishing near the river. Henry tried to dismiss them as accidents, but the workers grew afraid. One evening, after sunset, a young logger came running into the mill, shouting that he had found a man's body near the saw pit. Thomas went with Henry to see. The body was twisted, the face pale and frozen in terror. Around the corpse's neck was a strip of parchment, burned at the edges, with words written in a language neither of them recognized. Thomas knew it instantly. It was the same archaic Arabic from his mother's journal. Henry crossed himself. "What devilry is this?" Thomas said nothing. He took the parchment and locked it inside a chest in his cabin. That night, he compared it with the journal, and found the same passage. Whoever left it, there knew exactly what they were doing. Someone had found him again. The next day, Henry sent men to report the death to local authorities, but when they returned with the sheriff, the body was gone. Only the bloodstains remained. The sheriff accused them of playing a hoax or drinking too much. The men grew restless, afraid to work near the river. Weeks passed. Then another disappearance. Another worker, gone without a trace. At night, Thomas saw lanterns flickering in the woods, dozens of them, like ghostly fireflies moving in deliberate patterns. He began to dream of his mother, her face half lit by firelight, whispering warnings he couldn't quite understand. One night, unable to bear it, Thomas followed the lights. He crept through the trees, the lantern swinging in his trembling hand. The air grew colder, the fog thicker, until he reached a clearing. In its center stood a man in a long black coat, his back turned. "You shouldn't have copied it," the man said without turning. His voice was calm but filled with menace. The transcript was meant to die with Brennan. Thomas froze. "Who are you?" The man turned slowly. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's. "Names don't matter. What matters is the book. Where is it?" Thomas held the journal close under his coat. "It's safe," he said. "Safe?" The man smiled faintly. "No, Thomas. Nothing that holds the truth is ever safe. You've awakened something that was buried for centuries. And now it's coming for you. Before Thomas could move, the lantern flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the clearing. When the light returned, the man was gone. Only the trees whispered his name. Thomas ran back to the cabin, heart pounding. He packed his things and the journal. At dawn, he told Henry he was leaving. "I can't stay," he said. "If I do, others will die." Henry didn't argue. "Go, then. But wherever you go, remember, you carry more than paper in that book." Thomas left that morning, heading west again, deeper into the unknown. Behind him, the forest seemed to sigh with relief, or warning. The journal pulsed faintly in his hands, warm, almost alive. He didn't yet know that the real horror was still waiting ahead. The men who hunted him were not his greatest danger. The truth itself was. Would you like me to continue with part 5 in the same style, mixing historical realism with supernatural tension and simple, cinematic storytelling for a YouTube audience? The forests of Michigan could not hide him forever. Thomas thought he'd escaped the men who hunted him, but the truth he carried was alive, waiting, whispering, shaping his destiny. As the Civil War tore the nation apart, something older and darker was awakening, following him from the shadows of history itself. Part 5. The Haunting Ledger. The journey west took Thomas through endless miles of forest and farmland. He traveled mostly at night, sleeping in barns or abandoned cabins, always with his mother's journal close to his chest. The air grew colder as winter approached, and the loneliness pressed on him like a weight. Yet, even in isolation, he could not shake the feeling that something unseen was walking beside him. In late December 1863, Thomas reached a small town on the shore of Lake Michigan. It was called Benton Harbor then, just a cluster of houses, a church, and a small dock for trading boats. He rented a room above the local tavern and found work repairing barrels and crates for the shipping merchants. He told no one his real name. For a while, life settled into a rhythm. Work, sleep, quiet meals alone. But one night, he woke to the sound of pages turning. The journal lay open on the table across the room, though he was sure he had locked it away in his trunk. The candle he'd blown out hours earlier burned again, its flame steady and blue. The writing on the open page was new. His mother's hand, but words he had never seen before. The watchers move with the wind. They remember what was taken. When the ink stirs, they come. Thomas slammed the book shut, heart hammering. He whispered to himself, "It's just my mind. Just exhaustion." But deep down, he knew the journal was changing. Or maybe revealing what had always been hidden. The next morning, he visited the town church. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Clay, welcomed him warmly. Thomas told him he was looking for peace and perhaps some understanding of troubling dreams. Clay listened with patience. "Dreams are messages, son," Clay said. "Sometimes from God, sometimes from things best left unnamed." Thomas hesitated. What if what's haunting me isn't a dream, but something written? The Reverend's eyes darkened. Then it's no longer a haunting of the spirit, but of the truth. Words can bind as tightly as chains. Be careful what you carry. Thomas left uneasy. That night, he dreamt of Charleston again, of the sail, the faceless man, and the little boy he used to be. But in the dream, the buyer turned toward him. The face was still a blur, but the eyes burned like silver coins, and the man whispered, "The debt is not yet paid." He woke drenched in sweat. The window was open, the curtains fluttering like breath. On the table lay the journal, open to another fresh line of text: "You cannot outrun inheritance." Over the next few weeks, Thomas noticed strange events in the town. The tavern owner's dog refused to come near his room. A mirror in the hallway cracked down the middle without being touched. Some nights, he heard footsteps in the corridor when everyone else was asleep. Then, one morning, he came down to the dock and found a wooden crate washed ashore. His name, his real name, was burned into the lid, Thomas Freeman. Inside was a ledger, old, water-damaged, written in the same careful hand as the journal. But these entries were not his mother's. They were ledgers of slave auctions, signed by one name that froze his blood, Edward Rutledge. The same man who had sold him as a child. How had this ledger found him? Who sent it? The pages listed names, prices, and shipments from Charleston to New Orleans, and then across the Atlantic. But scattered among them were symbols, the same ones carved into the trees near the Michigan mill. Circles, lines, patterns. A code. Thomas compared the ledger with his mother's journal. The codes matched. The two books were part of a larger system, a hidden record of how human lives had been traded for centuries, disguised as commerce. And at the center of it all were families who had built their empires on that trade. The Rutledges, the Lawrence, the Whitmores, families whose descendants still sat in positions of power. He realized then that this was no ordinary inheritance. His mother hadn't just saved a journal. She had preserved a map, one that led to the origins of America's darkest wealth. That night, as he copied sections of the ledger into his notes, the air in the room grew heavy. The candle dimmed, and a low whisper filled the air. It was a voice, hollow and distant, like wind through the hull of a ship. "You were not meant to open it," the voice said. Thomas froze. "Who's there?" The shadows in the corner rippled. For a brief moment, he saw the shape of a man, tall, thin, dressed in 18th century clothing, his eyes pale as milk. Then the image faded, leaving only the smell of salt water and rot. Thomas backed away, heart pounding. The journal snapped shut on its own, the sound echoing like a gunshot. For the first time, he understood that the horror chasing him wasn't just human greed or corruption. It was something older, something tied to the very act of selling and forgetting souls. The truth his mother had preserved had called them, and now they were awake. The next day, Reverend Clay found Thomas at the church steps, pale and shaking. "You look as though you've seen death," the preacher said. "I think I've seen something worse," Thomas replied. "I think I've seen history trying to correct itself." The Reverend looked uneasy. "Leave this place, son. Go where no one knows your name. Some knowledge was never meant for mortal hands." That night, Thomas packed again. Before leaving, he went to the lake's edge and opened the ledger. He tore out the last page, the one with his name, and threw the rest into the water. The waves took it silently, as if swallowing a confession. But when he returned to his room, the torn page was waiting on his bed, perfectly dry. His name still burned in the paper, glowing faintly like embers. Thomas fell to his knees. "What are you?" he whispered. The candle flickered once more, and the air answered with a single word, one that froze his blood. Truth. He fled Benton Harbor that night, leaving behind the tavern, the church, and the lake that whispered his name. He didn't know where he was going, only that the journey wasn't over. The journal was no longer just a record. It was alive, and it wanted to be read. Somewhere far behind him, under the moonlight, the water rippled. And for an instant, a hand reached up from beneath the surface, clutching the drowned ledger tight. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, the final revelation, in the same style, 1,000 words, horror historic, simple and cinematic for YouTube? Hook. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. The journal that once told the story of pain and injustice had become something else, something alive. Wherever Thomas went, the shadows followed. The dead no longer slept, and the past was no longer silent. What began in a Charleston auction house was now awakening across the nation, feeding on guilt, greed, and forgotten history. Part 6. The Dead Remember. The train thundered through the night, cutting across the endless snow-covered fields of Ohio. Thomas sat alone in the last carriage, the journal wrapped in cloth beside him. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces in the dark, men and women with eyes full of accusation, whispering in languages he couldn't understand. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, the mind fraying under too much fear. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The journal had changed him. It had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. When the train stopped in Toledo for fuel, Thomas stepped onto the platform to clear his head. The night air was sharp and cold, but the silence was strange. There were no workers, no passengers, no sound but the hiss of steam. Then he noticed the frost on the windows of the last carriage. It had formed words. "You cannot run from what was stolen." He backed away slowly, heart racing. The words melted as the train's heat rose, leaving only the faint outline of handprints on the glass. Thomas continued west. He finally arrived in Saginaw, Michigan, where Marcus Thatcher's cousin, Elijah, greeted him. Elijah was a tall, broad man with kind eyes and a cautious manner. He owned a lumber mill deep in the forest, where the air smelled of pine and sawdust. "You can stay in the cabin by the creek," Elijah said. "No one goes there much. It's quiet." Thomas thanked him. For the first few weeks, life was peaceful again. He worked with Elijah's crew, cutting timber, repairing equipment, eating simple meals. The forest felt alive but in a different way, calm, watchful, not threatening. At least, not yet. One evening, after a long day at the mill, Thomas sat by the fire, the journal resting on his lap. He hadn't opened it since leaving Benton Harbor. But curiosity clawed at him. He thought of his mother's words, "Truth is a weapon. Choose your moment carefully." He opened it. The ink shimmered faintly, as if reacting to the firelight. He turned to a section he hadn't translated yet. It contained maps, sketched coastlines, rivers, and markings that seemed to follow the transatlantic routes of slave ships. But there were also strange symbols in the margins, circles around certain ports, with faint Latin words written beside them. One word appeared again and again, redemptio. Redemption. As he traced the lines, the fire dimmed. The air grew cold. A whisper rose from the pages, soft at first, then louder, until it filled the room like wind through hollow wood. "You carry the record of the damned." Thomas snapped the book shut and stood. The cabin door creaked open by itself. Outside, the forest had gone unnaturally still. Not even the crickets sang. He stepped outside. The moonlight spilled over the snow, and in its pale glow, he saw footprints leading from the creek to his door. Bare footprints. Human, but faintly burning, as if left by someone made of smoke and fire. He followed them to the water's edge. The creek was frozen, its surface glistening like glass. Beneath it, faint shapes moved, faces pressed against the ice, eyes open, mouths silently screaming. Thomas stumbled back, terrified. The faces vanished. Only the ice remained. When he returned to the cabin, the journal lay open again. But this time, the handwriting was not his mother's. It was his own. Words he had not written covered the page. "You cannot bear this alone. The truth demands witness." The next morning, he told Elijah everything. To his surprise, Elijah didn't laugh or call him mad. He simply listened, his expression grave. "I've heard stories," Elijah said slowly. "Old folks talk about cursed ledgers, books written by the enslaved to keep the names of their masters. They say the books remember. They say anyone who reads them becomes part of the memory." "Part of the memory?" Thomas asked. Elijah nodded. "The dead won't rest until the truth is known. You're the one they chose." That night, Thomas dreamed again. He stood in the auction yard in Charleston, but it was empty now. No buyers, no cries, just silence. Then he saw the faceless man who had bought him all those years ago. This time, the face was clear. It was Colonel Isaac Brennan. Thomas woke gasping. It couldn't be. Brennan had worked for the Union, not the traitors. But the journal had said it. Truth was dangerous, and men often changed sides when it served them. He lit the lamp and opened the journal once more. The first page, which had always been blank, now contained a single line written in fresh ink. "The buyer and the liberator are the same." Thomas's blood turned to ice. Had Brennan orchestrated everything, the sale, the rescue, even the war itself, to control the truth? Was the Union using the journal not to expose injustice, but to hide its own part in it? Days passed in uneasy silence. Thomas stopped sleeping. He worked long hours at the mill, trying to forget. But every night, the journal whispered from its hiding place. Sometimes he heard his mother's voice, sometimes the cries of people long dead. Then, one night in late February, Elijah came running from the mill. His face was pale, his breath ragged. "Thomas, the fire, the mill's burning." They raced through the snow, the sky glowing red ahead of them. The mill was engulfed in flames, the heat intense, the air full of ash and smoke. Elijah shouted for his men, but they were gone, no sign of anyone. Only the fire roared, devouring everything. And then Thomas saw it, figures moving within the flames. Shadows shaped like people, walking slowly, their faces hidden by smoke. One stepped forward, reaching toward him. Its eyes glowed silver, just like the man who had bought him. Brennan's voice echoed in the wind. You thought you could keep it from us. But history always collects its debt. The fire surged higher. Elijah pulled Thomas back, shouting for him to run. The flames followed, crawling across the ground like living things. They reached the cabin, then the forest. Everything burned. When the smoke cleared the next morning, the mill was gone. Elijah's crew was missing. No bodies, no traces. Only ash. Thomas stood among the ruins, the journal in his hands. The leather was untouched, not a mark of fire upon it. He opened it, trembling. The last page now bore a new inscription, written in both English and Arabic, "The dead remember. The living must answer." Thomas looked toward the rising sun. He understood then that he couldn't hide anymore. The truth wasn't just history, it was alive, demanding justice. And it would follow him until it was set free. He turned east, back toward the heart of the war, back toward Washington. The journal pulsed faintly in his hands, as if it knew its time had come. The boy who had been sold for $3 was no longer running. He was going to confront the men who had bought and sold the world, and the ghosts who refused to forget. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, The War of Shadows, next? Keeping the same cinematic horror historic storytelling, 1,000 words, simple and engaging for an American YouTube audience. Hook. Every war leaves behind ghosts. But in Thomas's case, the ghosts were not behind him, they walked beside him. The Civil War had ended, but the real battle was only beginning. The journal pulsed with secrets powerful enough to rewrite America's past, and the dead demanded to be heard. What Thomas would uncover next would prove that history was never about who won, but who buried the truth deepest. Part 7. The War of Shadows. Thomas arrived in Washington, D.C. under a gray sky, the air thick with smoke and sorrow. The city was still healing from the scars of war. Buildings half rebuilt stood beside burned-out shells. Soldiers without uniforms begged on corners, and women in black mourning dresses drifted through the streets like living ghosts. He kept the journal wrapped tightly in his coat, hidden from sight. Every time his hand brushed against it, he felt its heartbeat, slow, deliberate, waiting. He found lodging in a small inn near Georgetown, run by an older widow named Mrs. Keller. She had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but a kind heart. "You've got the look of a man running from something," she said as she handed him his room key. "Not running," Thomas replied quietly. "Looking." That night, he opened the journal again. More words had appeared since the fire. This time, they were dates and names, Brennan's name among them, followed by others. Beside each name was a single phrase, "The debt remains." He didn't sleep. The next morning, he went to the War Department to search for any record of Colonel Isaac Brennan. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, frowned as he searched the files. "No record of any Brennan in active service after 1862, he said finally. "Strange thing though, there's a report here that mentions his regiment's disappearance near Richmond. Vanished without a trace." Thomas left the building unsettled. Brennan's name was being erased. Piece by piece, the past was being rewritten. That night, as the clock struck midnight, a knock echoed through his door. He opened it slowly. A woman stood there, wearing a tattered cloak. Her face was pale, her eyes dark as coal. "Mr. Thomas," she whispered. "Yes, I was told you have something that belongs to us." Before he could reply, the candle on his table flickered and went out. When he lit it again, the woman was gone. Only the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. Thomas turned back to the journal, and his blood ran cold. On the first page, beneath the old inscription, new words glowed faintly, "The witness approaches." The following days grew stranger. He began seeing the woman everywhere, on the street, in reflections, standing at the edge of crowds. She never spoke again, only watched. And the journal began showing him visions, not dreams, but living memories. He saw slaves working under the lash of overseers who wore Union badges. He saw ships flying the American flag, loaded with chained men and women, sailing not south but north. The lines between villain and savior blurred until nothing was clear anymore. Then one evening, a man came to see him at the inn. He wore a long coat, his hair silver at the temples, his eyes sharp as glass. "Mr. Thomas," he said, "my name is Samuel Reed. I work with the Freedmen's Bureau. I understand you're in possession of a certain document." Thomas hesitated. "Who told you that?" "Let's just say," Reed replied, "the past has its informants." They spoke in the candlelight. Reed listened intently as Thomas told him everything, from the auction house to Brennan, from the fires to the whispers. When Thomas finished, Reed leaned forward. "You must understand, son. What you hold is not a relic. It's evidence. And evidence like that can destroy more than reputations. It can unravel nations." Thomas frowned. "So you believe it's real?" Reed nodded slowly. "I've seen too much to doubt the dead. The question is, what do you plan to do with it?" Thomas hesitated. "Tell the truth. That's all I ever wanted." Reed smiled faintly. "Then you should know, truth has a cost. Those who built this country on lies won't let it fall so easily." That night, Thomas dreamed again. He stood in a courtroom lit by torches. Figures in old military coats sat behind the benches, their eyes hollow. In the witness stand sat Brennan, his skin as pale as wax. "You think you understand," Brennan said in the dream. "But you've only read the first chapter." When Thomas woke, the journal lay open beside him. A map was drawn across 2 pages, showing a location deep in Virginia. Beneath it, one line, the Chamber of Debt. He knew he had to go. The journey south was long and lonely. The landscape was scorched from the war, fields of blackened soil and towns reduced to ash. He passed through Richmond, where ruins still smoked years after surrender. People whispered about strange lights in the forests at night, about soldiers seen marching without shadows. Finally, Thomas reached the spot marked on the map, a decaying plantation half swallowed by vines. The sign above the gate read, "Briar Hollow." The house stood silent, windows broken, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Inside, the walls were covered in soot. In one room, he found rows of ledgers stacked neatly on a table. Each was labeled with a year and a name. He opened one. The handwriting was identical to his mother's. "How is this possible?" he whispered. The floorboards creaked behind him. He turned. The woman in the cloak stood in the doorway. "This is where it began," she said softly. "Brennan's men recorded everything here. Every sale, every lie, every soul." "Who are you?" Thomas asked. She stepped forward, her eyes glowing faintly. "I am what they could not burn." Suddenly the candles lit themselves, flames flickering blue. Shadows gathered around the room, figures in chains, faces twisted in grief and rage. They filled the air, whispering in dozens of tongues. Thomas held up the journal. "What do you want from me?" The woman looked at him, her expression both sorrowful and fierce. "Not revenge. Justice. You must tell the world what was done here. Or the war will never end." The ground trembled. The ledgers began to burn, one by one, as if invisible hands struck matches. The woman reached for his hand. "Go, take the book, carry our names to the living." The fire spread fast. Thomas ran through the collapsing hallways, clutching the journal tight. Outside, the plantation erupted into flames, the screams of the dead echoing through the night. But this time, they didn't sound like pain. They sounded like release. When he reached the road, the woman's voice followed him through the smoke. "The past is not your curse, Thomas. It's your weapon." He looked back one last time. Briar Hollow was gone, swallowed by fire and memory. But he knew the war wasn't over. Not yet. The truth still needed to be told, and those who had buried it were still out there. And now, they knew he was coming. Would you like me to continue with Part 8? The Gathering Storm, keeping the same style. Cinematic horror, historic tone, 1,000 words, written simply and engaging for an American YouTube audience. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, it hunts you down. When Thomas escaped the burning ruins of Briar Hollow, he thought he'd left the past behind. But the dead weren't done with him. The journal that once whispered secrets now spoke in voices that weren't his own, and every page seemed to bleed history. What Thomas would soon discover is that some ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt justice itself. Part 8. The Gathering Storm. The journey north from Virginia was a blur of rain and sleepless nights. Thomas carried the journal close to his chest, wrapped in a cloth still damp from the storm. He avoided cities and traveled by back roads, his mind haunted by the vision of the burning plantation and the pale woman's words. At night, he dreamed of chains breaking, of ships sinking beneath black waves, of voices chanting names that had been erased from history. He would wake drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke still clinging to him. By the time he reached Baltimore, the world around him had changed. The war was ending. Union soldiers marched home, weary and scarred, while freed men and women filled the streets searching for lost families. Joy mixed with sorrow everywhere he looked. He rented a small attic room above a tailor's shop run by a kind man named Elijah Brown. Elijah was a veteran who'd fought for the Union and lost a leg at Petersburg. He rarely spoke of the war, but one night, as thunder rolled outside, Thomas found the courage to share part of his story. "I have something," Thomas said quietly, laying the journal on the table between them. "Something people were willing to kill for." Elijah leaned closer. "You mean that book?" "It's more than a book," Thomas whispered. "It's proof of everything they tried to hide. Names, crimes, conspiracies. The roots of what made this country bleed." Elijah studied him. "And what do you plan to do with it?" "Tell the truth," Thomas said. Elijah chuckled softly. "Truth, my friend, is a fine thing. But it can burn worse than any fire." That night, as Thomas lay awake, he heard a faint tapping sound. He thought it was rain at first, but it was coming from the journal. He opened it cautiously. The pages were turning on their own. On one blank page, words began to form in his mother's handwriting. "They know where you are." Thomas froze. He closed the book, his pulse racing. The next morning, he left Baltimore. He headed toward Pennsylvania, where rumors said a secret network of abolitionist printers still operated underground. He hoped one of them could help him publish the journal's contents. He found one such man in Harrisburg, an older printer named Silas Hodge. His workshop smelled of ink and candle wax, and his hands were permanently stained black from years at the press. Thomas told Silas everything, even about the visions and the woman from the fire. Silas listened silently, his face unreadable. "Son," he said at last, "you've stumbled onto something much bigger than you realize. These families you named, they didn't just profit from slavery. They built the banks, the factories, the railroads. They're the roots under every brick in this nation." "Then the world deserves to know," Thomas said firmly. Silas nodded. "It does. But the truth can't just be told. It has to be protected. If we print this, they'll come after you, and after anyone who helps you." Before Thomas could reply, the lights in the workshop flickered. The air grew cold, and the ink on the table began to move as if stirred by invisible fingers. Silas stared in horror as the ink formed words across the table's surface. "Not yet." Then the candles blew out. When light returned, the words were gone. The journal lay open on the table, and the map of Briar Hollow had changed. Now it showed multiple locations: Charleston, New Orleans, and one marked only as the seat of debt. Thomas's hands shook. "They don't want me to stop," he murmured. "They want me to finish it." Silas reached for the book, but the moment his fingers brushed it, the room filled with the smell of burning wood. He jerked his hand back. "You're dealing with something beyond men now, son." That night, Thomas left the journal in his satchel and tried to sleep in the corner of the workshop. He woke just before dawn to the sound of footsteps outside. 3 shadows moved past the window, men in dark coats, their hats pulled low. Silas motioned for silence and pulled open a trapdoor beneath the printing press. "Go," he whispered, "through the tunnels. They lead to the river." Thomas hesitated. "What about you?" Silas smiled faintly. "Old ghosts like me don't run. Now go." Thomas disappeared into the tunnel just as the door above shattered. He crawled through the damp passage, clutching the journal tight. The tunnel ended at the riverbank. He looked back only once, and saw the flames rise behind him. Silas's workshop was gone. Another fire, another warning. Thomas boarded a small ferry north. He sat alone on the deck, staring at the gray water. The journal rested on his lap, silent now, but heavy as stone. He thought about the people who had died because of it, his mother, Brennan, the woman in the cloak, Silas. All connected by secrets older than the war itself. When the ferry docked near Philadelphia, a young woman approached him. She wore a plain gray dress, her eyes alert but kind. "Are you Mr. Freeman?" she asked. "Yes," he said cautiously. "I'm Anna Wells," she said. "Silas sent word before the fire. He told me to help you." Thomas hesitated, studying her face. There was something familiar about her, something in her calm confidence that reminded him of his mother. She led him to a hidden cellar beneath a church. Inside were tables stacked with papers, maps, and printing tools. Men and women worked quietly, passing documents from hand to hand. "This is the Lantern Society," Anna explained. "We've been gathering evidence of crimes committed before and during the war, proof of the old trade that never really ended. Your journal could finish what we started." Thomas felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "Then we do it together." Anna smiled. Together. But as she reached for the journal, Thomas hesitated. The book was warm again, humming faintly. When Anna touched it, her expression changed. Her pupils widened. Her lips parted as if hearing voices only she could hear. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. "It's like they're still speaking." "They are," Thomas said softly. "They always were." That night, the two of them began copying the pages, one by one. But the deeper they went, the darker the words became. Records of murders, secret societies, oaths written in blood. Some pages seemed to shift under the candlelight, showing new text that hadn't been there before. When they reached the final page, the words burned into the parchment like fire: "The debt must be paid." The candle flickered out. The cellar grew cold. From the darkness, a whisper rose, 100 voices speaking as one. "Finish it." Thomas looked at Anna. "It's begun again," he said. And she nodded, fear and determination in her eyes. "Then we'll finish it." Outside, thunder rolled over the city like drums of war. The ghosts of the past were gathering, and this time, they wanted witnesses. Would you like me to continue with part 9? The debt must be paid, keeping it cinematic, eerie, emotional, and easy for a YouTube audience. 1000 words, story style, no dashes. Hook. Some debts are never forgiven. Some histories never die. When Thomas and Anna uncovered the final pages of the journal, they thought they had reached the end of a dark story. But the truth they had awakened wasn't done with them, it was only beginning to collect what was owed. Part 9. The Debt Must Be Paid. Philadelphia, 1864. A storm swept across the city like a curse. Rain hammered the rooftops while lightning illuminated the narrow streets. In the hidden cellar beneath the church, Thomas and Anna sat surrounded by candlelight and shadow, the journal open between them. Its pages shimmered faintly as if alive, as if breathing. Anna's hand trembled. "It's like it knows we're reading it," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "It's always known." The final words they had copied echoed in his mind: "The debt must be paid." He didn't understand what debt the book referred to, but he could feel it closing in around them. The air itself seemed heavier since that night. The candles burned lower than before, their flames dim and restless. They had spent weeks transcribing and translating the journal's final chapters, planning to send the information to trusted abolitionist newspapers in Boston and New York. But as each day passed, something strange began to happen. The pages changed. Sentences rearranged themselves. Whole sections disappeared only to reappear later with new names, new dates, new crimes. At first Thomas thought exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. Then Anna began to see it too. One evening, she pointed to a passage that had not been there before. It described a secret gathering in Charleston in 1793, wealthy men, slave merchants, and bankers swearing oaths to preserve their trade forever, even if slavery itself were abolished. They called themselves the Circle of Debt. Thomas felt his blood run cold. "They're still out there," he whispered. "Their children, their families, they carried on what their fathers began." Anna's eyes flickered toward the door. "Then they'll come for us next." They did not have to wait long. 2 nights later, footsteps echoed in the alley outside. A knock rattled the cellar door, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Anna froze. Thomas grabbed the journal and blew out the candles. The darkness swallowed them whole. "Who's there?" Anna called softly. A man's voice answered from the other side of the door. Calm, polite, too calm. My name is Mr. Lyle. I represent certain interests who would like to speak with Mr. Freeman. It's urgent, and it's in his best interest. Thomas didn't move. He knew that tone. He'd heard it before from Colonel Brennan, from every man who ever claimed to act in his best interest. Anna whispered, "We can't stay here." Thomas nodded. He grabbed a satchel, stuffed the journal inside, and together they slipped through the back passage into the rain. Behind them, the door burst open. They ran through narrow streets slick with water, ducking under bridges and through alleys until they reached the river. Thunder cracked above them, and the wind howled like a warning. They found refuge in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The air smelled of mildew and old rope. Thomas lit a single candle and opened the journal once more. Its pages were wet, but the ink was dry. In the flickering light, new writing appeared before their eyes. It was a list. Names of cities, dates, and then one phrase repeated again and again: "The reckoning begins." Anna stared at it, horrified. "What is this?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I think it's prophecy." That night, the candlelight dimmed until the shadows seemed to move on their own. Anna dreamt of fields soaked in blood and heard the cries of people she had never met. When she awoke, her hands were covered in soot, though there was no fire. Thomas sat beside her, the journal open to a page neither of them remembered writing. It showed a map, lines drawn across the Atlantic connecting Africa, Europe, and the American South. The path of slavery, drawn in red. But now the red lines were spreading north, pulsing like veins. "Do you see that?" Anna whispered. "Yes," Thomas said. "It's spreading, like it's alive." The following morning, Philadelphia woke to chaos. A warehouse on the waterfront had burned to ashes. Witnesses claimed they saw men in dark coats leaving the scene before the flames erupted. Thomas and Anna knew what that meant. The circle of debt was moving to erase every trace of their history. They decided to flee to New York, where the Lantern Society had allies. Disguised as traveling teachers, they boarded a train north. But the journey was restless. At every stop, Thomas felt eyes on him: soldiers, merchants, travelers. Some seemed to recognize him. Others simply stared too long. That night, as the train cut through dark countryside, Thomas drifted into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of his mother again. She stood beside the ocean, the same journal in her hands, her face glowing with firelight. "Thomas," she said softly, "the book isn't just history, it's memory. It remembers what was stolen. It remembers who paid the price." He reached out to her, but she stepped back into the waves. "The debt must be paid, my son. Not by gold, by truth." He awoke gasping. The journal was open on his lap, though he hadn't touched it. A single sentence glowed faintly on the page: New York. The ledger ends there. When the train arrived, Anna led him through the crowded station to a safe house hidden behind a bookstore. There they found other members of the Lantern Society waiting, men and women who had risked their lives to preserve forbidden knowledge. Thomas placed the journal on the table. "This is it," he said. "This is what we've been protecting." The leader, an elderly scholar named Reverend Green, leaned forward. "Then it's time the world saw the truth." They spent days preparing copies of the journal's pages to distribute secretly across abolitionist networks. But as they worked, Thomas noticed something strange. Every time they tried to copy certain pages, the ink vanished. It refused to be duplicated. The book was protecting itself. On the fifth night, the Reverend's assistant found a message carved into the wooden table beneath the journal. None of them had made it. It read, "The debt must be paid in blood." Before dawn, the church bell outside began to ring wildly. Smoke filled the air. Another fire. Another. Warning. They escaped through the basement tunnel, carrying the journal wrapped tightly in cloth. The city behind them burned, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Thomas turned to Anna. "It's following us," he said. Anna shook her head. "No, it's leading us." For a long moment, they stood watching the flames consume the skyline. The journal pulsed faintly in Thomas's hands, as if alive, guiding them toward one last destination. "Where does it end?" he asked quietly. Anna looked at the map still etched in her mind, the one that had appeared in the journal. "Charleston," she said. Where it all began. Thomas closed his eyes. The weight of history pressed on his shoulders. Then that's where we go. The book trembled once, like a heartbeat. The wind howled through the ruined city. The reckoning had begun. Would you like me to continue with part 10, final part? The Reckoning, in the same cinematic horror historic tone, 1,000 words, simple language, and an emotional YouTube-style ending with a strong call to action. Hook. Some endings aren't really endings. They're awakenings. And when the truth finally rises from the grave, no one, living or dead, can escape its fire. This is how the curse of the Circle of Debt finally met its reckoning. Part 10, The Reckoning. The train's wheels screamed against the rails as Thomas and Anna reached Charleston, the city where the first link in the chain had been forged centuries ago. The storm that had followed them north now returned with a vengeance, black clouds hanging low over the harbor. Lightning flashed across the water, illuminating the broken docks and abandoned mansions, the ghosts of the Old South. Anna pulled her coat tighter. It feels like the air itself remembers, she whispered. Thomas nodded. It does. And it's waiting for us. They followed the journal's final instructions to the ruins of a plantation once owned by the Ashmore family, founding members of the Circle of Debt. The path was overgrown, but the air was thick with a strange energy, as if the land itself was alive and watching. Inside the main house, the air smelled of wet earth and rot. Furniture lay shattered, and ivy crawled across the walls. In the grand hall stood a cracked marble statue of a man holding scales, one side heavier than the other. Thomas brushed off the dust and saw words etched beneath it, "The debt must be balanced." Anna stepped closer. "This is it," she said. "Where they made their vow." Thunder rolled, shaking the floorboards. The journal began to pulse in Thomas's hands, glowing faintly with a red light. He placed it on the statue's pedestal. The pages flipped on their own, landing on a final entry neither of them had seen before. It read, "Here lies the heart of the debt. To end it, blood must answer blood, and truth must face its mirror." Anna's voice trembled. "Thomas, what does that mean?" Before he could answer, the wind roared through the broken windows. Candles they hadn't lit suddenly flared to life around the room, forming a circle of light. Shadows gathered within that circle, tall, cloaked figures with hollow eyes. The Circle of Debt had returned. One figure stepped forward. His face was pale and thin, his eyes endless pits of darkness. "You've done well, Mr. Freeman," he said in a voice that echoed like many voices at once. "You carried the book where we could not. It needed a living hand to bring it home." Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. "You used me." The man smiled faintly. "We created the record to ensure we'd never be forgotten. You've given it life again." Anna stepped between them. "No," she said fiercely. "You created it to bind generations in your greed. But this ends tonight." The figures laughed, a cold, hollow sound that shook the floor. The leader raised his hand, and the candles dimmed. "End. There is no end. There is only the debt." Thomas grabbed the journal, holding it high. "Then it's time to collect." Lightning exploded through the ceiling, striking the statue. The room erupted in blinding light. The figures screamed as the floor split open, revealing a pit beneath the mansion. From the depths came voices, hundreds, maybe thousands, men, women, and children crying out as one. The forgotten souls of those enslaved, wronged, and erased. Anna's eyes filled with tears. They've been waiting for justice. The shadows writhed in terror as the light grew brighter. Thomas heard the voice of his mother whisper beside him. "Truth, my son, let it speak." He placed his hand on the journal and began to read aloud, the names, the crimes, the history that had been buried. With every word, the light intensified. The mansion trembled. The figures shrieked as if their very souls were unraveling. One by one, they dissolved into ash, their power burning away in the storm's fury. But the energy turned inward, swirling around Thomas and Anna. The journal hovered in midair, its pages glowing gold now instead of red. The voice of the dead thundered through the hall, "The debt is paid." Then, silence. When the light faded, Thomas and Anna stood alone in the ruins. The statue was gone. The journal lay open at their feet, its pages blank. The curse was over. Anna looked at Thomas. "We did it." Thomas nodded, though his hands trembled. "It's finished." Outside, dawn broke over Charleston for the first time in days. The clouds parted, and sunlight spilled across the harbor. The air felt cleaner, lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled. They left the ruins in silence, walking toward the train station. The journal remained behind, its story complete. But as they passed through the gates, Thomas felt something slip into his pocket, a single torn page. He pulled it out and froze. On it were the words, "Truth never dies. It only waits." Anna smiled sadly. "Then we'll keep telling it." Years later, that same page would be found in a museum in Washington, D.C., framed under glass, marked only with the initials TF. Visitors would walk past it without knowing the full story, without hearing the whispers that still lingered in the air at night. Because some debts are eternal. And some truths still haunt the living. Call to action. If you felt the chill of this story and the weight of its history, don't let it fade. Hit subscribe, share, and comment below to keep these stories alive. Every voice, every click, keeps the truth from being buried again. Stay with us, because the next tale waiting in the dark might be even closer than you think. The end.